I used to work security in a museum in the southwestern part of the United States. The basement of the place was almost always locked because there was a lot of valuable stuff kept down there. Whenever someone needed to go down to retrieve something, the rules stated that they had to be accompanied by at least one person from security. This was due to some vague story about an incident which had occurred down there years before. No one seemed to know exactly what that incident was, but we all assumed it was related to an attempted theft or something. Anyway, some repair work needed to be done in the basement, so some contractors were brought in. Me and another security guard were given the job of staying down there with these 4 workers for security reasons. The job was supposed to last 2 weeks, and I swear, every day something odd would happen. I mean, in the first place, it just felt unexplainably creepy down there. I personally didn't have any reason to feel weird about the place, but somehow being down there for any length of time made my skin crawl. I felt like someone's eyes were on me, and I was always just really anxious. There always seemed to be work tools missing when we would go down there at the beginning of the day. There were these weird drafts coming in and strange metallic smells. There weren't any windows down there, but there was one area toward the back that seemed unfinished. Kind of like a crawl space that went under a portion of the building. As far as I knew, it didn't lead to the outside in any way, so it didn't seem to make sense that we would feel those drafts sometimes. It wasn't always, but when it happened, it did seem to go along with the metallic odor. The contractors themselves also seemed freaked out by being down there. It was like they just wanted to get the job done, and it seemed unusually quiet down there every day. It wasn't like they would joke back and forth like you would expect among a group of guys who worked together all the time. They just did what they had to do as quickly as possible. Anyway, sometime during the second week, my security colleague, who was usually down there with me every day, called in sick to work. So it was just me and the contractors. Everything was pretty much as usual, except it had maybe been extra drafty that day. At one point, I went off to use the bathroom. A few minutes after I had gone in the bathroom, I started to hear screams coming from the hallway. I rushed out as fast as I could, and I saw 3 of the guys hauling ass up the basement stairs. They looked petrified. I ran after them, and when we were upstairs, I asked what had happened. They said their other colleague, the 4th guy, had walked toward the back of the basement out of sight, and had started screaming. They went to look for him and couldn't find him. They said they were freaking out about how he could just be gone, and they heard a loud screeching noise like some giant eagle or something, and then something scraping along the cement floor toward them. Apparently, they had all lost their shit at once and turned around and ran. Some of the random weird basement stories I'd heard before started coming back to me. I'd never paid much attention to them before. Maybe the fact that no one was allowed to go down there without security had a deeper reason. I called for help and managed to get 2 people to go with me to locate the last contractor. Right when we got down there and headed toward the back area, we were hit with this horrific smell. It was that metallic scent, but now it was mixed with a rotten sulfur smell. When we went past this pillar right at the back of the basement, we finally noticed the worker guy leaning against it, facing away from us. He looked like he was staring at something, and then we looked toward the back and saw this thing maybe 6 to 7 feet tall standing on 2 legs that was just unfathomable. It seemed partly human and partly giant lizard. Dinosaur-like. It had these piercing yellow eyes, and I could see the black claws on the hands it held in front of itself. Its head was like a lizard, and it was staring at us with an aggressive look. The worker was staring back at it like he was paralyzed. He didn't seem to be all there. He was glassy-eyed and mostly non-responsive. I yelled, "Run!" and I grabbed his arm and half-dragged him behind me, and we all took off screaming toward the stairs. I don't even know if that thing followed us. We managed to make it up and slammed the door, and I locked it. When I looked at the guy, I realized that the back of his jacket had been torn, like slashed, and shredded, like something had clawed at him. There was some blood too, so it broke the skin. We ended up calling an ambulance and sending him to the hospital. The police came too and evacuated the building and police taped the whole area. We all gave statements and were sent home and told not to come back to work until we were notified. Well, guess what? After about 2 weeks, we heard that our jobs were no longer available, and we were given some severance pay, and I ended up going back to my hometown in Illinois to regroup. To this day, I still don't know what the freak was going on there. When I've tried to describe that day to people, it sounds like I've lost my mind or something. I just tried to let the whole thing go and move on. I'll be the first to admit that I wasn't the most career-driven person. I wasn't anything less than a slack-off growing up, and it's kind of a wonder I even graduated high school. But after that, it's not like I had a promising career in my future. I was looking at a life spent removing pests from suburban houses or risking my life to put out fires. And, knowing my track record, I probably wouldn't have been good at either. I had a good couple of friends though, and one of them was generous enough to offer me a job as a traveling salesman working for their uncle's company. It seemed like the only option as a deadbeat 22-year-old who'd been fired from their last 2 gigs. I happily accepted and mentally decided it was time for a change. So I started up with the job, traveling to small neighboring towns in my beat-up VW for the first few months. I was making a modest living, and it felt good to complete a job well done. I was eventually told I had to go on the road for a 3-town trip, so I'd have to find a place to stay for a night. This job was anything but glamorous, and the lodging was up to me to figure out. With the limited means I had available, I was lucky to have even found the place I did, the Crampton Lodge. The Crampton Lodge was not a lodge at all, but a 1-story, battered and beaten motel with an interminably lit vacancy sign. It was the only establishment I'd seen for miles, and having already hit 2 stops that day, I was tired and getting ready to sleep in the car. The motel lobby was dirty-looking and poorly lit. There was no one behind the desk, so I tapped my hand on the dinky little bell. An old, sleepy-looking man emerged from the back office with an unfriendly expression on his face. He almost wordlessly checked me into room number 4 and handed me the key. I offered a smile, but he was already shutting himself into the back office before I could do so. Room number 4 was expectedly unwelcoming. There was a dingy queen bed and a small, super old-school TV on top of a scuffed dresser. The bathroom was a horrible green tile from floor to ceiling. It made me dizzy. I turned on the TV to block out whatever sounds might carry over from the other rooms. The connection was pretty shabby, but I finally settled on some old black and white movie. I took a shower, but I felt grosser than I had before. Everything about this place was just off. I just wanted to fall asleep, wake up, and leave. But when I walked back into the bedroom, the TV station had changed. It was an entirely black screen with a perfectly defined graphic of a white square in the middle, growing and shrinking rhythmically. The picture quality was too good for the TV. I was puzzled. I tried to change the channel, but to no avail. When I pressed the power button on the remote, still nothing, and nothing even when I unplugged the TV from the wall. The screen just kept glowing back at me, that white square taunting me, growing and shrinking as it did. I was honestly pretty freaked out, and I was going to march right up to that grumpy old man at the front desk and demand a different room. But when I touched the handle of the door, I winced. It was hot, like there was a fire outside. I glimpsed out through the dinky blinds covering the window. No fire. But when I tried my hand on the door again, the heat was unbearable. I groaned. This was definitely the worst place on earth for a traveler. I saw movement through the gaps in the blinds. If I could get that person's attention, maybe they could help me out. I ducked my head around and under the blinds. There was someone out there, all right, but it didn't look like they wanted to help me. Their face was remarkably smooth and pale as a ghost white, actually, as white as a piece of paper. Just inches from the glass of the window pane, This face stared expressionless and straight into me. It was hard to take in. They were completely bald, including their eyebrows. There were zero signs of aging whatsoever on their face, just white, stretched skin wrapped tightly around bone and tissue. The lips were a cold, bitter red like blood in the snow. I stared into their black eyeballs with a dry mouth. Had they been waiting for me? Where had they come from? They weren't standing there the first time I looked out, just seconds before. I watched as the figure reached a ghastly white hand up in front of their face. I don't know how or why, but I couldn't stop myself. I mirrored them with my hand, following in a trance as both of our palms pressed flatly together, separated only by the glass of the window. When we did this, I felt a surge of either blistering heat or blackening cold shoot up through my arm, sending me staggering backward. At the same time, the power in my room shut off, including the picture on the television. I sat on the ground, panting and terrified for what felt like hours. I was too scared to get up, to look out the window. When the doorknob rattled and began to turn, I felt my heart drop to the bottom of my stomach. I gulped. But it was just the grumpy old man from the front desk. He had switched a fuse and the power would be back on shortly. I nodded, still in disbelief. I woke up the next morning in that same spot. I'd fallen asleep there. But when I saw that fresh light of morning, I had never been so relieved. I wasted no time in vacating that room, ready for the day of work, determined to do whatever it took to never wind up in a place like that again. I've lived in Jersey my whole life. My parents lived in Jersey their whole lives, and so did their parents, and so on. I hated living in Jersey. I knew we were always close to New York City, but my parents were never keen on a day trip. As a matter of fact, they staunchly refused to take me or any of my 6 siblings. I never understood it. We lived in Pinelands, and that pretty much describes the place to a T. We lived just on the outskirts of a gigantic nature reserve. Just over 1 million acres of forest. Our lives weren't very comfortable, something you'd probably expect from a long line of Pinelands apologists. My father worked in lumber and Mom raised the 7 of us. There was only one real rule she made us follow. Don't wander into the woods after dark. Like most things, none of us questioned our parents on this. It seemed like a pretty reasonable request. Just over 8 years old, Scout was the youngest of the bunch and the definition of a troublemaker. Clumsy, yes, but ambitious. Naive, but wise beyond their years. It's hard to describe how special Scout was. There was this interminable spark lit inside of them. That spark of childhood, of joy, of unending possibilities. We were play fighting after dinner a few weeks before Scout's 9th birthday. My mom was overwhelmed with housework and things were just as chaotic as usual. We began playing an innocent game of tag. The last time I saw them, Scout was running out the kitchen door, laughing and smiling. I had been just a few feet behind them in my pursuit. I was it, after all. But as soon as Scout's head disappeared out the door and into that foreboding darkness of nighttime, something stopped me in my tracks. I stood still for a few minutes before telling Mom. A few minutes too late. I guess there really is such a thing as a mother's intuition. Mom knew immediately that Scout would have run into the woods. That's where we played in the daylight and threatened to do after dark. And it seemed my mother also knew that Scout would never be seen again. She was right. By morning, Scout was officially listed as a missing person. My father revealed nothing of how he truly felt. He began working longer nights and we rarely saw him. My mother didn't have that choice. She had 6 children relying on her, and as transformative of an experience as losing a child is, she had to keep herself together so that she could keep all of us together. So while the rest of my siblings marched on in life with Mom leading them and Dad completely withdrawn, I fell somewhere in the middle. There was no way around the truth. I was partially responsible for Scout's disappearance. I knew it, and I think the rest of the family did too. On the anniversary of Scout's disappearance, the house was so cold, literally and figuratively. We had lost this undeniable warmth, and it was all my fault, and Dad was a mess and Mom was a soldier who didn't deserve any of it. The police didn't find any trace of Scout. Figures. Families like mine weren't exactly priority number one when it came to missing persons. I knew that if anyone could find Scout, it would be me. So I didn't head home at sunset like I usually would. We loved these woods in the daytime, and that was when we explored them. But according to Mom, the woods were no place for children at nighttime. Or maybe she was implying something darker. I didn't care. I was 11 and a half. I could make my own grown-up rules. But that confidence didn't last long. I was a decent way from home, but I was no deeper than usual. For some reason, though, as soon as the sun disappeared and I was out there alone in the dusk, I felt miles away from anything I'd ever known. The pines take on a cloak of darkness at that hour. The trees insulate the land, and as the light disappears by the second, the forest transforms into some slow whirring refrigerator. It comes alive with insects and creatures too shy to come out in the light of day. I felt a chill touch my feet before moving up my body. It dawned on me that I was not alone. The darkening pines chirped with life from every branch. For some reason, I was comforted by that revelation. Insects were tangible beings that Scout and I would collect in jars and show off to our older siblings and our folks. We pointed at pictures of them in the battered old encyclopedias Dad would bring home from garage sales. But then I heard a crunch in the distance. No insect or woodland creature. It was like some giant foot pressing into the earth. But something I knew. Let me remind you that I was a child. I set off in the direction of the noise. I applied that fondness for the insects to the unknown being in the woods. As I tell this story now, one saying keeps circling in my head, and curiosity killed the cat. And boy, was I a curious little thing. My feet flew across the forest floor in hot pursuit of whatever magical, surely harmless forest creature I was about to discover. Maybe they'd name the species after me. That was what happened when we played pretend. The atmosphere grew rapidly darker. With just the faint moonlight poking through the treetops, I kept my eager eyes on the ground ahead, dodging fallen tree trunks and scattered bramble. I barely noticed the smell at first, but then it engulfed me. It was that awful, retching, stinking odor that we goofed about on long drives, where we'd pass a stretch of road and would suddenly erupt in fits of immature laughter, comparing the stench to my eldest sibling's flatulence. Sulfur. That's what it was. I guess I took it as a sign that I was moving in the right direction. Maybe I didn't have a choice. Because when I finally looked up, so deep now in the black wilderness, I'm sure that something forcibly directed my gaze at the giant in front of me. It was like a monster from a scary book, but not any that Dad would have brought home. It was double, maybe triple, my size. Its body looked almost like a horse, but the creature was standing on two legs. On either side of its scaly chest was a large, bat-like wing that spanned the length of its body. Its eyes were glowing red, piercing into mine. That one moment felt like an eternity. I was positively frozen in fear. I watched in horror as the thing opened its wide, dripping mouth, releasing a roaring screech that literally blew wind in my face. It looked like it was about to pounce. No, it was. I knew it then and I know it now. And I don't know what compelled me to do this. I said something that stopped it. Scout. The creature seemed to recognize that name, my voice, my face. I don't know. In a split second, a softness crossed its features. It was so distinctively familial, childlike, curious. I still cannot come to terms with it. I know it sounds crazy, but I think I saw Scout, but only for a flash. Because then the thing flapped its wings with such force that this time the wind knocked me down. I sat there shaking, watching in awe as this thing flapped off into the darkness deeper into the woods. I scared the hell out of my parents. When I got home, they were spitting mad, but I could understand why. I don't know what happened that night, or what I saw, but maybe the woods really are a bad place for a child to wander at night.